Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am Chair of APA's New Urbanism Division, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November 8th, and we will be hearing the presentation, Making Room for Middle Housing, House Bill 2001, and Lessons from Oregon. Or Oregon. I guess we're going to have that conversation. I'm not quite sure how you guys pronounce it, so someone's going to have to clue me in.
It's Oregon.
So for technical, it is Oregon officially? It's Oregon. Got it.
Very,
Thank you.
very officially.
Oh, got it. Yes. Okay. Oregon. Got it. Um, yes, people are typing in, letting me know exactly how to say it. Thank you. So for technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in that chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen. And for your content questions, same thing, just type them in to the chat box in your webcast toolbar. If your question is for a particular panelist, I just ask that you state who you want to answer that question. That helps me when I'm organizing all of your questions for our Q&A at the end. Get to my next slide. Okay, on your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2019. Thanks to all of those participating chapters and divisions for making these webcasts possible and free to members. In particular, today's webcast is sponsored by APA Oregon. So thanks to you for joining us and for putting together today's webcast. We have a lot of folks on the line. This must be a pretty exciting topic. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. So these are it. This is it for 2019. Believe it or not, we're already scheduling 2020 sessions. So be sure to head over to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, so you can sign up for these few last remaining sessions for 2019. Today's webcast in particular is available for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. To log those CM credits, head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and then you can search either by today's title or the event number. The event number is shown there. You can get all this information after our webcast, again, on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education. You can check on that by just, again, heading to our webcast webpage. We have an ethics and a law session that are both available through December 31st. So if you need those credits, head on over to our webcast webpage and you can do some on-demand listening to get those credits. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube, search Planning Webcast. There you'll find that we have about 2,500 subscribers and over 300 videos for you to view. So head on over there. We will have a recording of this session available on our YouTube channel at the conclusion, and we'll also have a PDF available on our webcast webpage at the conclusion as well. So that's it for my intro. I am now going to turn it over to Alan to jumpstart us. Alan, the controls are yours.
Thanks, Christine. So let me first give you a quick introduction of me. My name is Alan Lazo. I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon out here in Portland. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we are a private nonprofit civil rights organization whose mission is to end housing discrimination and ensure equal access to housing throughout the state of Oregon. So thanks for joining us here today. I know there are not quite 400 folks that are on the phone today, and I think folks are logged in and listening to this for lots of different reasons. And I think for whatever reason brought you to this discussion today about middle housing, one of the first things that we need to do is really ensure that we ground these conversations that we have around housing and community development with this clear understanding of how it is that we got here where we are today. In particular, I think to understand the context around racial segregation in housing and the racial discriminatory intent of exclusionary zoning, are the earliest 20th century that led us to the institutionalizing of single-family residential zoning. But before I jump into the how did we get here, I also like to talk about where is here. And for me, one of the ways to really convey that is through this study that I saw from some psychologists at Yale University. They asked a couple questions. The top question there is about average income. The one that's more interesting to me is the bottom one there that asks about the wealth gap. So the accumulated wealth among families. And it asks, for every $100 in wealth accumulated by the average white family, how much wealth has the average black family accumulated? And you can see there are choices from $0 to $25, $26 to $50, $51 to $75, $76 to $100, or $100 plus. So just, there's not an online quiz or anything. You can't click on those buttons, but just think to yourself, how much accumulated wealth does the average black family have for every $100 of accumulated wealth of a white family? And what this Yale study found, okay, and there's the question there. What the Yale study found was there are two things that are really remarkable in this study to me. One is the first dot there, the purple dot, shows the reality of the answer. The answer is that black families have about $11 of accumulated wealth to every $100 that white families have. So about the 10th of accumulated wealth. We're going to continue to talk about that a little bit, but that's due in great part to the ability to build equity in home ownership or through home ownership. The other part that's interesting here is that gray dot on that top line of family wealth. It notes what the perception of people who answered the survey was. The perception is that that black families have about $83 of accumulated wealth for every $100 of white families. So there's this huge perception gap about the wealth gap. And these Yale psychologists attributed this in part in this study to racial segregation. The fact that we are such a racially segregated society that we have the inability to understand how other communities live. The inability to understand the impact of this history on other members of our community to access opportunity. So with that, again, I think we want to talk further about how it is that we got here. So I think really to understand this, we go back to the start of the 20th century, and this is a history that's so expertly illuminated in Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Now, I know that we don't have an online quiz and I can't see all of you, but if I asked how many folks have read The Color of Law, I hope I wouldn't be surprised by the number of hands that went up. So I'm hoping that everybody's had a chance to read this book. As Richard outlines in his book, in the early 1900s, cities across the country instituted land use zoning rules that explicitly excluded residents by race, particularly black residents. The first to do so was in Baltimore, which in 1910 adopted an ordinance prohibiting African Americans from buying homes on blocks where whites were a majority and vice versa. In 1917, however, the Supreme Court ruled that practice illegal when they ended a similar racial zoning ordinance in Louisville, Kentucky, under the case Buchanan versus Worley. This ruling then gave rise to the nefarious practice nationwide of land use zoning that utilized proxies for race, namely economic status as a means of exclusion in the form of single-family residential zoning. Across the country then in the 1920s, there was this planning movement to create single-family residence zones that would exclude blacks economically because those planning efforts could no longer exclude explicitly by race. Again, as Rothstein lays out in his book, there was this intentional, systemic, and institutional way of exclusion, especially at that federal level. And he notes in the book that there, quote, there was little doubt about who the persons to be avoided might be. Now, while that explicit practice of zoning to segregate by race may have been made illegal in the early part of the 20th century, there also is little doubt that the impacts of exclusionary zoning has continued to have that outcome from an economic standpoint, and then by extension from a racial standpoint. Here in Portland, this slide's going to come up again later, where the presenters are located. This map highlights in yellow the 15 original single-family zones from our first zoning map in 1924, during that period of exclusionary zoning. It overlays the areas in green then that represent the highest census tracts in our community today. So we continue to see those disparities in our community here. This environment then in the early part of the 20th century also gave rise to other racially exclusionary practices that we tend to be more aware of in the 1930s, things like racially restricted deed covenants in single family developments, in individual homes, racial steering by real estate agents, and the redlining maps that were used. The example here is of Portland, that was used by lenders and insurers to deny access to capital in what were predominantly communities of color throughout the country. At the same time, the federal government also began investing in an expansion of access to single-family housing and promoting easy home ownership, most notably through the insuring of home mortgages. So with the creation of the Federal Home Administration in 1934, you could buy a home with 10 to 20% down and pay the rest off with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, right? The way we think of buying homes today. However, the FHA's underwriting standards incorporated these same racially segregated principles and biases, using redlining maps to guide appraisers in the loan risk analysis. From 1934 to 1962, the FHA underwrote $120 billion in loans. However, fewer than 2% of those loans went to non-whites. This, by the way, is the root, as I said earlier, of that wealth gap, that slide I showed earlier. The predominant mechanism, again, for building wealth, and particularly generational wealth in America, is through home ownership. So then following this national trend towards single-family home ownership, by the mid part of the 20th century, single-family residential zones or districts, including here in Portland, expanded to dominate the majority of our cities as we know them today. Here in Portland, enveloping nearly 80% of the residential land in our city. So we know that this exclusionary and segregated history, coupled with the targeted denial of opportunity for the Black community, also set the stage for the mid to late 20th century dynamics of urban renewal and gentrification in communities, including the involuntary economic displacement of the Black community out of what had been their historic communities. We've seen that here in Portland, a push of the Black community out of that redline neighborhood you see there, kind of in the upper middle part of that map, out to the outer skirts of our city. So I wanted just to highlight and bring forward this kind of brief history to set this framework for recognizing those disparities that we have today, including that wealth gap that I opened with, that are a result of this exclusionary history and really capturing part of that, how it is that we got here. You know, these disparities continue to be reflected in things like home ownership that are highlighted here in Portland and the disparate home ownership rates for communities of color. Blacks and Latinos, for instance, own homes at a rate of around 30%, while that number is not quite 60% for whites. And this is roughly unchanged from more than 50 years ago when the Fair Housing Act was passed. So again, that really sets the stage for talking about the history that continues to create and show up as disparities in our community. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Taylor Smiley Wolfe to talk about what's happening here in Oregon further.
Great, thank you, Alan. I'm going to pull my screen up here. Great. Can everybody see? Can folks see the presentation? Great. Awesome.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taylor Smiley Wolfe. I'm currently the policy director for Home Forward, which is the housing authority for Multnomah County here in Oregon. But previously, I was serving as the Speaker of the House's policy director, Speaker Kotek, in the Oregon legislature for the past 3 sessions, including 2019, when I had the privilege to work on this really exciting legislation, House Bill 2001. So I'm going to cover a little bit about the motivation for the bill. Oh, let me see if I can change the slides. Great. The motivation for the bill, the sort of legislative process around how the bill was passed. It's surprising and unusual for a bill as controversial as this bill was to be introduced and then passed in the first session. Sometimes it takes a couple of sessions, although Oregon has been having a conversation at the statewide level about middle housing and how we need to accommodate growth in our communities, especially because we have a strong urban growth boundary system here in Oregon. And folks like to say in the land use community that what people hate more than sprawl is density. So folks don't want to go up and they don't want to go out, but the reality is that our state is growing. So House Speaker Tina Kotek introduced this bill at the beginning of the legislative session, and the motivation was really multifaceted. So first, Oregon is experiencing a statewide affordable housing crisis. And the speaker really talked about this issue as having a choice, not about whether or not we're going to grow, because we know that as a state we're growing, but is that growth going to happen in a way that sort of reifies the patterns of opportunity and disparity in access to opportunity that exists currently? Or are we going to make a different choice and try and grow in a way that fosters more inclusive communities? So the state is experiencing a shortage of 155,000 homes. So that was a major motivation. The history that Alan talked about, residential segregation by income that we see today, and income as a proxy for race and ethnicity, was also a motivation for the legislation. And also, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. The state has a really important role to play in addressing local political dynamics that make it really challenging to have some of these conversations at the local level. So here, I just wanted to draw your attention to this study, the Housing Underproduction in Oregon report, which was done by Up for Growth Oregon. This shows that this crisis is really statewide. So the colors on the map here, the darker orange, are places where there was less than half of a home permitted for every household formation. So you can see that it's really across the state that we're experiencing this shortage. It's not just in metropolitan areas like the Portland metro area. And Alan touched on this a little bit. This is a map of Portland that kind of overlays the exclusionary history of the earliest zones in the city, and it has a very close overlap with the highest income areas in the city today. And so this is a sense, I kind of refer to this term as gold lining. There are communities that are very difficult for folks to access who are earning lower incomes. And so it's essentially the self-segregation of the rich is a pattern that we see. And in Oregon, folks don't like to talk about just Portland. So I wanted to show a map of Salem as well, which is where the state capital is located. So on the left, you can see a map. The yellow color is where it's single family residential zoning. And on the right is a map that was put together by Opportunity Insights. This is Raj Chetty's research group, which shows the median household income of residents by zip code. And so you can see the darker red colors here are lower incomes, and then the blue and green are higher incomes. And you can see some correlation there between the places that are single family residential and having higher incomes, whereas places that allow more multifamily housing tend to have folks that are earning lower incomes. And the motivation for this legislation was not just the income pieces here, but also the connection between income and race and ethnicity. So Alan talked about this, so I won't go into too much detail, but we know that a large portion of our land in cities around the state is zoned for single family detached housing, that most of the folks who live in those communities own their homes. And we also know that there are extreme gaps by race and ethnicity in who is able to access home ownership. And lastly, the role of the state was a really important consideration here, because there have been jurisdictions around Oregon, and I know we're going to hear more about the experience in Portland a little bit later in the presentation, that have been having this conversation locally and have been really having a hard time, I would say, moving things forward that change local land use planning rules in a way that allow for more inclusive growth in communities. And there's also a growing body of research that really links the increased role of the state in lower income segregation. So this is one of my favorite articles on the topic, but just wanted to pull a quote from it. We also find the more local pressure to regulate land use is linked to higher rates of income segregation, but that more state control is connected to lower income segregation. This was a study that looked at states and cities around the country and kind of assessed the role of the state and then the subsequent segregation by income at the local level. It's a really fascinating study if you have time. And then in our experience in Oregon, the city of Portland, I wanted to draw your attention to the date that this article was published, started having a conversation about the residential infill project, which was about allowing middle housing in the city in 2016 or a little bit before, and are still having that conversation today. So that was a motivation as well, that we need to be making these changes, and the change at the local level was happening too slowly in the opinion of the speaker at that time. So the legislation had three major goals. The first was increased housing choice. The second was meeting the statewide housing goals. And then the third was increased supply of a less expensive housing option. So missing middle housing on average is less expensive than detached single family housing of the same age, which was a really big motivation for the legislation, wanting to address the housing crisis, increase housing choice for folks, and especially a housing choice around a less expensive housing option. So prior to the introduction of the bill, we did in the Speaker's office a lot of stakeholder outreach to kind of get feedback on an initial early concept. The bill dropped at the beginning of session and had a number of committee hearings in the House Human Services and Housing Committee that were very full of public comment and input. As many of you can imagine, this is a topic that brings a lot of energy to it. And as a result of hearing a lot of concerns kind of emerging during that time, we pulled together a bipartisan legislative work group to address some of the major concerns with the legislation. And just a very quick overview, Gordon will go into this later. The bill required that cities above a certain size allow duplexes, triplexes, quads, and cottage clusters in single family zones, which was unprecedented. No state has done this before Oregon. So the work group had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans and included local jurisdictions, a representative from the League of Oregon Cities, and also a couple other jurisdictions who were at the table that had experience implementing middle housing in their jurisdiction. Folks that represented home builders and developers of both affordable and market rate housing were at the table, land use advocates, and then staff from agencies who would be tasked with implementing some of this work. So the bipartisan work group really worked on a list of key amendments. I won't spend a ton of time on these, but one of the key concerns from local jurisdictions was making sure that they had some local flexibility around how this would be implemented. I think what we heard from cities is that they would really prefer to make these choices on their own, but in the absence, in the presence of a state foundation for the type of work they had to do, they wanted as much flexibility as possible. So there was an amendment to allow cities to regulate the siting and design of middle housing, and this really got at the concern around neighborhood character, which is a largely subjective concern because I think it can be defined differently depending on the person. But in terms of being able to regulate siting and design, folks can make sure that the design of the home fits the existing characteristics of the neighborhood. There were fewer requirements for small cities in amendments to the bill. So originally, all cities above 10,000 were going to be asked to allow all the middle housing types of duplexes, triplexes, quads, and cottage clusters. But through the amendment process, those requirements changed. So smaller cities when the bill finally passed, between 10 and 25,000, had to just allow duplexes on each lot that allowed a single family home, whereas larger cities and cities within the metropolitan area had to allow all the middle housing types somewhere in a single family zone, in addition to duplexes on single family lots. Some amendments also gave cities more time to develop local codes. So the smaller cities have to implement their code by 2021 and larger cities by 2022. There was a lot of clarification around middle housing to be allowed. So it cannot be allowed outside of the urban growth boundary. It cannot be allowed in unincorporated, or it does not have to be allowed in unincorporated areas that don't have sufficient urban services. So there was just a lot of clarification for folks about where it must be allowed in their communities. And this was a really important change. Legislators on both sides of the aisle had significant concerns in hearing from their local communities about infrastructure challenges that might make it really difficult for them to allow middle housing. So the bill created an extension process for cities if they did an assessment and found that the infrastructure in a particular community was so poor that it couldn't even accommodate an additional duplex or 2, that they would be allowed to apply to the Department of Land Conservation and Development for an extension to their requirements to comply with the law. The bill also removed some language that would have required local jurisdictions to defer SDCs. I don't know what those are referred to in other places in the country, or if they're referred to in the same way, but just the cost of doing development until the certificate of occupancy. And then finally, the bill appropriated $3.5 million in technical assistance to local jurisdictions to both do this planning work and then also to do some of those infrastructure plans that would enable them to apply for an extension if necessary. So despite all of these changes that really helped to get bipartisan support behind the bill, which was essential in its eventual passage at the end of the session, there were still some outstanding concerns and questions. that it was really important, and Madeline will talk about this too, how we communicate about middle housing makes a really big difference. So some of those questions that were outstanding continued to be, will the bill harm neighborhood character? Will it undermine the land use planning system and local control? Does it increase housing affordability? And so making sure you have answers to all these questions is very important. So on the neighborhood character question, I think, again, that's subjective, but giving local jurisdictions the control to design middle housing is important. Whether or not it undermines the land use planning system, I think that's a question that's really unique to Oregon, but I think there's this tension between local control and state control. And in this instance, in the midst of a statewide housing crisis, the legislature made a decision that it makes sense for the state to set a framework around this particular issue and give local jurisdictions kind of flexibility within that framework. And then around housing affordability, we had some data from the Office of Economic Analysis showing that middle housing was less expensive on average than detached single family housing. And so giving people that choice between, in areas that are redeveloping, you can have a brand new single family home, or you could have a duplex or one that is subsidized affordable, and it would be less expensive in both cases. So I won't go through all of these key concerns and questions, but if anyone would like to follow up, please send me an email. I'm happy to talk about how we responded to some of these questions. But these were some of the outstanding concerns with the bill. But ultimately, it passed, which is very exciting, making Oregon the first state in the country we have concerns with the use of the term eliminate single-family zoning because single-family homes are still very much allowed under the bill. It just requires that local jurisdictions allow other housing types as well. And this work could not have been possible without a really large coalition of folks that helped to support the work both in and outside of the legislature. And I want to call attention to the sort of broad range of people who are at the table. So AARP supported the legislation because they have a lot of concerns about seniors who are wanting places to age in place. The Home Builders Association, the Coalition of Communities of Color, which is a statewide organization here, of many organizations that are focused on racial justice work. And 1,000 Friends of Oregon is one of our state sort of land use advocacy groups. So all of these, and a lot of affordable housing developers. So it was a really broad range of folks in a coalition that made this possible. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who worked on this legislation. It's important. And I'm going to hand it off to Gordon Howard, if I can get let's see. Oh, there you go.
All right, thank you, Taylor. And let's get my screen up here. My name is Gordon Howard, and I should say good afternoon or good morning to some of you. We on the West Coast, it's a little after 10. We watch football games on Saturday and Sunday starting at 10, and we do webinars starting at 10 as well. Thank you, Taylor. I work for the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is the statewide planning agency for the state of Oregon. Develops, implements, advises, regulates, and enforces Oregon's statewide planning program, which was first started in 1973. There are 19 statewide planning goals. Planning is implemented locally by cities and counties with their comprehensive plans and land use regulations, but those plans and regulations are required to comply with state law. Oregon does have a fairly robust, compared to I think just about any other state in the nation, statewide land use planning system. Going forward in our, let's go to our first slide here. As Taylor noted, this is groundbreaking legislation, House Bill 2001. I think it's key to point out that it does not end single-family zoning. As Taylor said, it ends exclusive single-family zoning. There's a big difference. Within cities of a population between greater than 10,000, and all cities in the state, and then all jurisdictions in the Portland metro area must now allow a duplex on any lot or parcel that allows a single family residence. In other words, everywhere there is single family zoning in those communities now have to require or allow a duplex on such properties. There are additional requirements for cities greater than 25,000. They must allow In addition to a duplex on every lot, they have to allow triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, which are defined in the statute, and townhouses, also defined. And the language is a little different in areas zoned for single-family residences. That does not mean every single lot, as opposed to the duplex requirement, but cities have some discretion, and we'll be getting into what kind of discretion they can have on where to apply these higher intensity and density middle housing types going forward. For the medium-sized cities, those are all cities outside the Portland metro boundary, which is a 3-county area in the northwest portion of the state with about 40%, 40 to 45% of the state's population. All cities outside of there, 21 of them around the state, with a population of between 10 and 25,000, are required to allow the duplexes on each lot. As I said, I believe I said there's 21 such cities. Then the requirements for large cities, and the large cities include all non-Portland metro cities with a population of more than 25,000. There are 11 such cities, 12 such cities now around the state. Woodburn, a city in the Willamette Valley, is now above 25,000. And there are 22 jurisdictions in the Portland metro area that have the requirement for large cities. And those are the cities that need to plan for the higher levels of middle housing in areas zoned for single family residential development right now. The legislation, as Taylor noted, does allow some flexibility. It allows medium and large cities both to regulate siting and design of middle housing, but those siting and design provisions cannot be designed to frustrate the provisions of the statute. We've already gotten indications from cities around the state with varying enthusiasm about the new law. There have been a couple of city councils who have stated they intend to move forward and look progressively at this law. There are a couple others who have demanded that the legislature repeal it at its next session and have stated they're going to do their best to frustrate the provisions of the law. So we're going to have to look pretty closely at that issue. One question, in addition to the siting and design issue, the question is regarding the scope of the area zoned language. How much of the area zoned for single family development have to allow the higher intensity middle housing types, triplexes, fourplexes, et cetera. Clearly, corner lots, areas near transit facilities, those kind of issues will come forward. As with all statutes involving land use in the state of Oregon, the Department of Land Conservation and Development and our commission, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, set up 7 appointees by the governor, are authorized and designated to write rules, administrative rules, to implement the provisions of the statute. So we're going to be looking at these issues, and within the next year, working on administrative rules to implement the provisions of the statute. One of those provisions is to deal with the issue of cities that might not want to implement the law, and that is that our agency is going to prepare a model code. 2 versions of that code will be required, one for the medium cities that are required to allow the duplexes, and one for the large cities that will have to allow, to some extent, higher intensity middle housing types. The codes are going to be written and adopted as an administrative rule by our commission. They'll be written so that local governments will be able to implement them directly if they choose to, but also they are going to be written so that if a local government does not adopt its own compliant code, and the smaller cities are required to do that by June 30th, 2021, the larger cities by June 30th, 2022, then the model code that we have adopted must be applied directly by those local governments. Now, there's always the possibility, and we're hopeful that some cities will actually want to apply our model code because it'll be such a good code that implements this bill. We'll see if that occurs, but if a city, there's not room in this for a city to avoid or ignore the state law because to her credit, Taylor and the speaker designed this bill to make sure that the direction of the state gets completed by local governments. There is also, as Taylor pointed out, the infrastructure-based time extension requests. There was as an example of this in some discussion about this bill before during its debate. The mayor of Albany, Oregon, a city of about 50,000 in the Mid-Willamette Valley, was interviewed on our local public broadcasting network, and amidst a lot of other arguments against the bill, which I would characterize as less, not as good, she pointed out there are a few areas in Albany, the city of Albany, where it's single-family zoning, and these areas have no public sewer system. They're all in septic systems. That's a classic, it's clearly an example of an area where there needs to be some infrastructure most likely brought into that area before it can handle the additional density of duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. And that's really the kind of situation where we expect local governments to apply for extensions of time, limited extensions of time to fix infrastructure in areas so that the duplexes and other middle housing types can be accommodated. They will have to demonstrate and develop a plan of action, and we're going to have to, as an agency and their commission, come up with rules defining and limiting such requests so that, once again, the reasonable requests are considered, approved, and the local government then fixes the problem and then can implement the bill in a few years, but not abused to the point where infrastructure deficiencies are used as an excuse to avoid implementing the middle housing provisions. As Taylor also mentioned, the bill provided a fairly large, for Oregon numbers, a technical assistance fund for local governments, $3.5 million that our agency will administer for local governments to produce and adopt middle housing codes for their communities, and also the infrastructure-based time requests. And as I mentioned, rulemaking is occurring. We are required to have the rules in place by the end of 2020. We have the assistance in Oregon. All significant rulemaking requests have a rulemaking advisory committee. We have a very large committee of interest groups around the state, local governments, housing advocacy groups, developers' interests, conservation interests, to help us prepare the rules, the administrative rules that will fill in the gaps and implement the bill. And I think, we're also doing a lot of outreach around the state to local governments and communities about what this bill means. And when we do that, we try to emphasize, we've already started those programs, that this is going to be bring housing choice to communities. Alan went over well the history of housing racism around in the nation and also in Oregon, very well brought about or mentioned or stated in The Color of Law, the Richard Rothstein book. But in our work, we try to emphasize the positives. This will provide, land use flexibility for property owners. It'll provide more opportunity for different housing choices in communities for different age groups and income levels. There are great existing neighborhoods in Oregon around the state that were built before the advent of exclusive single-family zoning that include different housing types. That are good examples to show to people. I think also very interesting will be what the impact of this new law will be on existing neighborhoods. We think that unless there's a very unusual economic circumstance, the changes in existing neighborhoods will be gradual as people decide to convert or not their existing homes or rebuild. Of even more interest perhaps is the impact on new neighborhoods. Will developers, when given the chance of building middle housing types from scratch in areas that are on the edge of urban areas that are being added, and that does happen in Oregon, we are a growing state, will they choose to, they'll now have the choice to put up duplexes or attached units instead of single family detached homes, and will they do that? And I think that'll be an interesting thing to look at as we go forward. in Oregon and perhaps elsewhere. We are getting a lot of assistance from consultants to do some of this work in the technical aspects of it, particularly the infrastructure issues. We are not an engineering agency, and so we are needing a lot of technical assistance on that. And finally, there were several other provisions of House Bill 2001. Just briefly, the one I wanted to emphasize was the last one, a very important item. There are communities around the state now, and as I'm sure elsewhere in the nation, that have private codes, covenants, and restrictions that prohibit middle housing types or accessory dwelling units. This law prohibits the establishment of any new CC&Rs that prohibit those housing types. It is generally considered to be impossible and unconstitutional to invalidate existing CC&Rs that do that, although perhaps that'll change at some point in the future, as it did with racially restrictive covenants in the past. But as of now, the law states that there can be no new CC&Rs that prohibit those housing types passed by, obviously not by cities, but by the local developers or homeowners involved. And that concludes my presentation. So I'm going to pass it on to Morgan Tracy, who is with the City of Portland. Go ahead, Morgan.
Thanks, Gordon. So I'm Morgan Tracy. I'm the project manager with the Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, working on the residential infill project. I just want to reflect a little bit. I've been a planner here with BPS for the last 14 years, and in the past we've struggled to get the public involved in some of our projects because they get a little wonky and a little confusing, a little in the weeds. But this is a project that we've had no shortage of public involvement. So it's a topic that attracts a lot of attention, and that's actually been a really good thing. I want to present a high-level overview of residential infill. This is our first major update to the single dwelling zone zoning rules in the city in about 25 years. As we think about Portland now and into the future, we see our median home prices are increasing while the median area incomes are not keeping up. And to illustrate that point, in 2011, a family that was earning about 80% of the area median income could afford a median price 2-bedroom home. Between 2011 and 2018, the median home sales prices increased 60%, or about $150,000, which is about $20,000 a year. So to afford the median price home today, families must earn between 130 and 160% of the median area income. Household sizes, which is the number of people that are living in a house on average, are decreasing while the home sizes are increasing. And as we look ahead at our population, we're at about 650,000 people today. We're projecting another 260,000 people moving here by the year 2035. For our Oregon audience, that's about the size of Springfield, Medford, and Bend combined. And for our national audience, that's Madison, Wisconsin moving here. And the types of housing our future households will need will also be different. So we're seeing fewer households with children, a doubling of our senior population, those over 65, as well as greater racial diversity in the city. Let's see. Okay. So the project was built around somewhat competing interests. We were trying to address compatible infill while increasing housing choice. But as the project progressed, housing affordability became more of a critical issue. And the city was in the process of updating our comp plan. So we were also attempting to integrate multiple emerging objectives. So that wheel that you see on the right is a few of those, such as providing clear rules for development and ensuring that our new rules were economically feasible, allowing housing adaptability so they can be customized to suit more people's needs, avoiding increasing the risk of displacement resulting from our zoning changes, all this while ensuring development fit the neighborhood context. So after extensive public outreach and receiving over 10,000 comments on the draft, staff produced an initial proposal which first set a floor area ratio for single dwelling zones that reduced potential home sizes by almost 2/3 compared to today's rules. So as you can see in this illustration, the largest possible house allowed on a 5,000 lot is about 6,700 square feet. That's the house on the far right. The proposed rules would limit building sizes to 2,500 square feet. Second, we slightly expanded the range of allowed housing types. So whereas today in the city, we allow for a house with an accessory dwelling unit or a corner lot duplex, the proposal increased this to 3 units, a house with 2 ADUs, a duplex with 1 ADU, or a corner lot triplex. Lastly, we've created a map of where these increased options would be available based on a quarter-mile distance from frequent transit to encourage and support greater transit ridership and reduce reliance on the automobile, et cetera. So this accounted for about 2/3 of our single dwelling zone area, but certainly left large areas out. So you can see in the map, areas of East Portland, parts of North Portland, and much of Southwest were excluded. We then ran an economic analysis of our proposal, comparing the current default zoning against the proposal, and found that we were only going to see about 10 extra units produced per year over our default. Those floor area ratio limits suppressed development of houses and instead shifted the market to building more duplexes. Consequently, demolitions were reduced pretty significantly. So in simple math terms, what you're seeing there is if you produce the same number of units on half the development sites, the demolitions are dropping. We also saw that these new duplex units would come on the market at about 35% less than a house twice its size. So that's reflecting the unit size there. So the Planning and Sustainability Commission got hold of the proposal, and we began our hearings with the PSC. But before we started their deliberations, we asked them to identify their top priorities. And this was really a critical move for us because there are many ways to measure this project and different dials to change to get us there, each of them incurring a different set of trade-offs. So we wanted to understand where the PSC's target was. And they landed pretty much on ensuring that the benefits and burdens of different types of growth were shared equitably, increasing the range of the units that are available and providing them in more locations, and decreasing the quote-unquote entry fee into neighborhood housing by providing for less expensive options. So to do that, first they upped the number of allowed units from 3 to 4 and removed corner lot distinctions by allowing triplexes and fourplexes on any lot. And it turns out 4 units was a serendipitous cutoff as it aligned well with our tax assessor appraising rules as well as financing criteria. Second, they also sought to encourage the creation of these additional units. So they added an escalating scale of additional floor area as the number of units increased on the site. So in this example, a house could be 2,500 square feet, whereas a house, an ADU or a duplex could be 3,000 square feet. Triplex or fourplex would be 3,500 square feet. This had also the benefit of creating more diversity in the types of units that were being created. A 4-bedroom house, 3-bedroom triplex, a 2-bedroom triplex, a 1-bedroom fourplex, and so forth. And the third big change was to expand the map to allow these units more broadly across the higher density single dwelling zones. This was partly in response to the testimony the commission heard from affordable housing providers and others who expressed that some of the areas that staff had left out were in the greatest need for more affordable options. It was also to respond to the need for more equitable outcomes by providing greater opportunities for areas that had been previously excluded. So the commission recommended allowing these units everywhere in these zones except for lots with environmental or natural hazard constraints such as floodplains or landslide risks, as well as lots on unpaved streets. So this new map, as compared to the last map, was about 66% of the single dwelling zones. This represented close to 90%. Our next challenge was to evaluate the direct effect of these zoning changes on involuntary displacement. So when redevelopment occurs, when a house is demolished, what is happening to the folks that are living in that house? We were not trying to identify general displacement pressure, which is hard, if not impossible, to predict and quantify and isolate those different drivers. So that's the neighborhood values are increasing based on all sorts of different things, like new restaurants coming to an area, or new park being built, or new transit line being extended. So we were focused specifically on the redevelopment action triggered by the rezoning. We also focused on low-income renters because these are the folks with the least say in whether their house is being redeveloped. And when displaced, they have the greatest difficulty finding replacement housing in the same area. We looked at the effects across the whole city, as well as specifically areas with higher shares of vulnerable populations. And we define that as populations with a higher share of people of color, renters, low income, or folks without a college degree, to assess whether the burdens and benefits were equitably being distributed. So if we saw lower displacements in neighborhoods with not a high level of vulnerable populations, but we saw increases in areas with higher vulnerability, that would not be a good outcome. The analysis quantified displacement probabilities over the course of a 20-year planning period and found that in nearly all the census tracts, displacement was reduced. So that's the blue census tracts in that map. There were 3 neighborhoods that saw a net increase, shown by the red census tracts. And this localized increase represents a sum total of about 75 households over 20 years, averaging fewer than 4 per year. So not a large number, but not nothing either. And so that caused a lot of discussion at our Planning and Sustainability Commission. And it's also important to remember that the map is only reflecting the net change between our default zoning and the proposal. So that meaning while displacement is being reduced overall, displacement is still occurring. It's just occurring to a lesser degree. So while the project represents an improvement over the status quo, more intervention beyond just the blunt tool of zoning is going to be needed. We also reran our economic analysis on the Planning Commission's package and found 24,000 additional units were financially feasible, but this number is more realistically constrained by the market demand and our regional growth share. So more realistically, we expect close to 4,000 additional units over the 20-year period. More significant, perhaps, is the variety and types of housing that will be produced. Rather than 12,000 large, expensive single homes, we'll see between 4,000 and 8,000 less expensive fourplex, triplex, and duplex units. A slight increase in demolitions, but again, this number is tied to the 24,000 unit number. So with fewer actual units being built, it reasons we would actually see a net reduction in demolitions, and a significant reduction in average rents by over 56%. As a result of introducing more triplexes and fourplexes in the mix with smaller average unit sizes. And I think it's really important to point out in both of our proposals that link to the building size was critical in driving this average unit cost number down. So if you allow for a 3,000 square foot house or a 6,000 square foot duplex, you're not going to see much in the way of reduction in terms of your unit costs. So planning is about getting us well positioned for the future. One major challenge has been communicating the high cost of doing nothing and the limitations of addressing a housing crisis by only leveraging the market through zoning changes. So I mentioned more is going to be needed. Zoning is one tool, and we're dealing with that. We also have other actions that we know that we need to take in terms of addressing the inequities in our housing situation. But we know what our default future holds in terms of zoning. We can merely keep building large, out of reach, and generally mismatched housing and find ourselves in a corner 20 years from now when we've utilized the remaining single family capacity. Or we can begin to set ourselves on a different trajectory so that 20 years from now, we aren't pining for those older, naturally occurring affordable fourplexes that don't exist because they weren't allowed in the first place. And so with that, I will pass it on to Madeline. Let's see if I can do that. All right, Madeline.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Kovacs, and I am a Senior Outreach Associate for the Sightline Institute. My presentation today is going to be just a little bit different. I'm going to talk both about some of the work that I did while I worked for 1,000 Friends of Oregon, coordinating the Portland for Everyone Coalition, which was a local coalition in Portland advocating for zoning reforms and more housing. And then I'll also talk about the work that I've done in the last year at the state level, messaging on missing middle housing and how those two things kind of flowed together. So I'm going to touch a little bit on what it's like to be an organizer talking about some of these things, and also from a broader communications perspective, how we talked about missing middle housing and some of the things that we learned along the way. If I can advance. So the first really critical lesson, it seems so simple, but it's so important, is show, don't just tell. So when we're talking about, development bonuses and FAR and accommodating parking. It can be really hard for people to visualize what's being proposed and kind of wrap their heads around it. And as Morgan said, the physical character of the neighborhoods was something that people were really concerned about. So at Sightline, I've linked to an open source Flickr photo album of missing middle photos. To contribute to it, you can actually email editor at Sightline, and we will add to it. It's again, it's open source, anyone can use it. But so one of our most successful tactics in talking about missing middle housing was really simple. We said, why is this duplex illegal to build on 90% of Portland's land? Why is this small triplex illegal to build on 90% of Portland's residential land, right? Why can't we have accessory dwelling units? Why can't we have these cottage clusters? Why are these things not legal to build in the majority of our city? And so when people were able to look at those photos of the housing types that were actually being proposed, that were also accurate in terms of layout and scale, they were able a lot of the time to say, oh, that's actually really nice, and I would actually be fine with more of that in my neighborhood. The photo on the bottom, this is actually a series of narrow lot houses built on 25 by 100 lots. And it was really complicated to explain kind of the design tweaks that were being proposed for narrow lot development. But I was able to show, this is one of my favorite pictures to show at a community presentation and say, look, these are actually narrow lot homes. The catch is that there's no on-site parking, and people were able to see kind of how beautiful that streetscape is and how good it is for pedestrians and how attractive the homes can be if you design them well. And it also gets into, you can visualize that trade-off, right, between parking spaces, one in front of the house, but for every on-site parking space, you have to have a curb cut, which takes away one on the street. So it's just a good way to use plainer language to kind of walk through some of these trade-offs. And that was actually really powerful to be able to help people get there faster and to be able to articulate what they wanted to talk about as well. One of the other things that we did was we went on walking tours. So the person with the microphone up there is my friend Vandana. She's a coordinator for AARP Oregon. She was really wonderful. We coordinated with AARP to do a tour of Buckman, an inner east side neighborhood in Portland that has a lot of missing middle housing types. And it really, what we're really talking about is gentle density, right? And so demonstrating visually what we're talking about relegalizing to some extent is really important. And the good news is that we have many neighborhoods that have these kind of development patterns already. And actually some of the most desirable and attractive neighborhoods have tons of grandfathered in missing middle housing that you wouldn't be allowed to rebuild today. And so walking people through and talking and letting them see the landscape and see the internally divided older houses that were divided during World War II, or see the cottage clusters and see the multiple mailboxes on the front doors, see the duplexes. They could get a feel for the neighborhood, and then we talked about the numbers. Then we said, this is triple the density allowed in most single dwelling zones in Portland, and they would gasp because they absolutely couldn't believe it. And so beginning with that visceral understanding and then talking about the numbers can be really, really important. I should also mention that we talked in person to over 3,000 Portlanders over a couple years. And we also pointed out that it takes a longer conversation, right? So you're not going to be able to do in 2 or 3 minutes what you can do in 2 hours. So we really took the time to walk people through a lot of the details, listen to their concerns, and say, if this neighborhood burned down today with all this missing middle housing, we could not build back to the same density. And people really understood that. One of the most important framing things at the state level was, it's really not a ban on single family homes. You can still build a single family home. You can just build these other things too. And so one of the first headlines that came out in the Willamette Week, talked about a ban. We started to talk more about what we're really talking about here is legalizing housing types that have been illegal to build in our city for the last 50+ years. And the Portland conversation is fairly successful at talking about housing diversity from the beginning, and advocates really took that to heart. If we want to go a step further, we could also talk about, apartment bans, but that really depends, and that framing isn't always necessarily appropriate for middle housing. And to Taylor's credit, the Speaker's office was incredibly consistent too in using this positive framing all session long and talking about what we're actually talking about doing here. And so the national headlines after the bill passed began to reflect that a little bit, but we're really not talking about a ban. We're talking about legalizing choices, and that was incredibly important. And to a bit of Morgan's point, when speaking with local communities about this, there's a lot that we can actually agree on. And one of the things that we can actually agree on that people see happening is that the current rules aren't working. In Portland right now, you can build only on the majority of single family lots, you can only build one huge house. You can build a 6,700 square foot house on a 5,000 square foot lot. That works for some families, but that really doesn't work for a lot of families. And our zoning is not keeping pace with people's needs, whether you want to retire in your community, whether you want to provide a home for an aging relative, right? We need more flexibility, and we need a variety of housing types in our neighborhoods. My colleague also really was wonderful in pointing out, why are we spending $500,000 to replace one smaller home with one much larger home? That does nothing for supply, prices, or housing choices. And so really just starting from, we can agree that this is not working, allows you to then further that conversation to talk about how we could improve the situation. We also talked about the displacement happening now. A 1-for-1 demolition, again, is a net loss for something smaller and cheaper that could have gone in there instead, or you could have done adaptive reuse. And people are being priced out of the city right now. One other thing that we did was we really listened to people. People are already telling you what language to use and how to talk about these issues in a way that makes sense to them. So really, as organizers, we really took the time to listen and did a lot of work kind of translating a lot of this up for some of the policymakers. It's also important to take this language to meetings with electeds and decision makers, because they're going to be hearing from the community at hearings as well. And we need to be making sure that we are using consistent language when we're talking about these things that people will understand. It's also really important to use stories and narratives so people can see themselves in what we're talking about, and you can talk about tangible benefits to real people. That's really important in someone thinking, this is actually important to me. I will never forget the time, not Morgan, a totally different project, but an unrelated project. A planner came back and was talking to me and said, I was talking about these projects penciling and like no one cared. And I was like, well, that's because people don't really care about that. And it was really interesting walking through kind of what we tend to get caught up in a technical world and what people really care about on the ground. And so the more that we're able to ground our conversation in values and a vision for our city that we want to see, the more successful we're going to be. This is a series of maps that a colleague of mine made for us. This is back in 2017. And we just looked, these are homes that would sell for over $400,000. And you can see the difference from 2012 to 2017. Portland is becoming less affordable when you can't share those rising land costs among more homes and you can't find ways to build less expensive housing. That red map is going to keep marching out. And that is a narrative that people across the income spectrum can see themselves in, and that does two things. One is it really lets people see themselves in the same story, and also helps build empathy for people for whom it's even worse. Homes over $400,000, by the way, are not affordable to over 68% of Portlanders. So almost 70% of Portland looks at that map and goes, yep, I can almost not afford to live here, or have already left. So this might seem a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's also good messaging. What would Mr. Rogers do? So the reason I put this up here is because another thing we talked about is, what does being progressive and inclusive really mean, not just as a concept, but on your block and in your neighborhood. And I think people are really grappling with this right now. And we have to be really clear. As Morgan said, Portland is experiencing a wave of growth. Our communities are changing and our cities are growing. So we have a choice about how we want to grow. And unless we want to, bring up the drawbridges and build the walls, we're going to have to make room for new neighbors. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that in an equitable way. So we also worked really closely with affordable housing builders and providers. Affordable housing providers are often hamstrung by the same rules that all developers are, in terms of costs and permitting times and delays. It's actually worse for a lot of affordable housing developers because when there's a scarcity of multifamily housing, the competition for those lots goes up, and they can lose essentially to private developers as they're putting together financing, among other problems. So it was incredibly important to listen to nonprofit affordable housing developers about what they would need when the rubber hits the road to deliver an affordable project. I included a tweet from Habitat for Humanity talking about Habitat being priced out of single dwelling zones as well. They're increasingly building duplexes and triplexes as one of their core models for development, and there are really good reasons for that. So there was a great interview on OPB with Habitat for Humanity talking about how they needed these rule changes to let them serve families at about the 60%, 30 to 60% median family income for home ownership. I would say affordable housing providers were also critical in breaking things down for legislators and really talking about the details again of where rubber hits the road. Another thing that's really important is to talk about the additional community benefits, right? So we're not just talking about housing, we're also talking about transit, overall cost, access to amenities. Find out what these decision makers care about and who they listen to, and figure out what additional messengers you can bring who can tell that part of the story. Critical supporters of HB 2001 came from Portland Public Schools, Sunrise, other climate justice advocates, NAACP Eugene, Oregon Environmental Justice, and AARP Oregon was really big. We have the carbon emissions of large detached single family homes are much bigger than attached housing. This is Jim, who is holding a sign that says, ADUs and large trees, we can have both. So the urban tree canopy was really important for the Portland conversation. But again, the more that you can demonstrate broad, deep, and diverse support for your policy agenda, the better off you will be. And there's so many of those intersections when we're talking about housing. And then lastly, this is really important. Be upfront about zoning reform's limitations, right? We're not done. We didn't just pass HB 2001 and now Oregon is reintegrated. Like that's not how this is going to happen. So don't overpromise and be precise about what's achievable. So we can acknowledge that while zoning reforms can help make sure that we don't further segregate our neighborhoods into the future, and that over the long term we're providing more variation of price points and affordability and begin to reverse these trends, they need to be paired with aggressive funding and programmatic tools to achieve even deeper affordability levels, especially in high opportunity and high amenity areas. So per home prices by sharing increased land costs might go down, but we need to pair that with programmatic and subsidized support so that we can get those numbers even lower. So one of my favorite ways to talk about this, I learned from another colleague of mine. He said, sure, building enough homes will undoubtedly help everyone in the long run, but that does nothing for someone standing there with an eviction notice in their hand. And so we have to make sure that our housing policies don't exacerbate the underlying housing shortage, while also pursuing policies and a lot more funding that can provide immediate relief. And Morgan, again, did talk about the anti-displacement that the city has been doing. A lot of that research has been because advocates have been asking for the Anti-Displacement Coalition in Portland. And while it's good that in some lower income neighborhoods, like in in Wilkes, Colleen Mill Park, and Powellhurst, Gilbert, see decreased displacement. In a few neighborhoods, we do see increased displacement, and so that will have to be addressed going forward. Even though overall, because of graduated development bonuses, right, a lower redevelopment rate, and incentives for preservation and reuse, displacement goes down. That doesn't mean that we're done. And I should say that the displacement study doesn't yet take into account bonuses for regulated affordable housing. So I'm excited to see how much better that would get if that was taken into account, but I know that that's hard to do. I'm going to hand this over to Alan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Madeline. I think the thing that's really exciting about this group today is how well all of these pieces come together. And so I think, my job kind of coming here at the very end is to kind of put a wrap on this and also to be the meme guy, right? So I'm gonna give you some some wrap-ups that I've come to realize in these two efforts around HB 2001 and around the Portland residential infill project. And so I've listed 5 points here that kind of summarize these different elements of what's happening in Oregon, especially from the frontline community's perspective. So that first one, around leading with the conversation about race, you saw it today when we started talking about the history of racial segregation, but also, as you heard Madeline talking about, it's really an opportunity for us to shift this conversation to values, right? Away from what the form and function might look like, but values like equity, inclusion, and opportunity. You saw that out in Minneapolis when they passed in the city there, what also got termed as ending single family zoning out there. But again, there's a headline that talked about confronting its history of housing segregation. You saw the same context on Madeline's slide here. So here in Portland, we've been having that conversation for a while, and actually just recently, the Bureau of Planning Sustainability Morgan's group released a report about the racial history of planning right here in Portland. If you saw, there's also one that came out in the Bay Area from the Haas Institute about the racially exclusionary history in San Francisco Bay. There's a conversation similar to that happening out in Boston. So again, it's an opportunity to change the conversation to values around this history of exclusion that we can turn into inclusion and opportunity through housing choice. But also, as Madeline indicated, that's not the end of the conversation, right? The example I would use is the FHA. That was a program that was intended to increase housing opportunity, housing choice through home ownership, but it had an outcome that continues to have disparities for communities of color today because they were locked out of the opportunity. So we really need to, in that second bullet, really figure out how it is that we, how do we seek intended outcomes in the work we're doing? And for me, one of the core principles of this nuanced conversation really is around changing this narrative we sometimes use from accepting that oft-used phrase that we might have unintended consequences to accepting the responsibility for what are to be intended outcomes of this work. This then means that if we lead with that race narrative, it becomes important in these conversations that if we use that history as a means to justify our proposed actions, we ought to be intentional about the outcomes we seek to remedy that history, which for me as a person in the fair housing movement and under the Fair Housing Act can be difficult. But maybe that's a panel discussion for another day. But it does lead to talking about or looking at how we do have these conversations. And one of those ways is really reflected in the work that Morgan and the city is doing around the residential infill project. So it's interesting, this is the third time you'll have seen this map come up about the displacement burden, the net displacement burden after we implement the residential infill project. So again, it shows the areas that are vulnerable, areas of net increased or decreased displacement burden by vulnerable areas. Let's see if I can get this to switch here. And if we look further into the details of this, what you see here is, so first we have to recognize, as Morgan said, that displacement through the residential infill project will be decreased overall. So it's a good outcome that we have. And we also know, as Morgan said, that doing nothing is not an option for us because displacement is occurring and will continue to accelerate if we do nothing. So that becomes not an option. But when we look closer at these figures here, what you see is that the displacement risk is proportionately a disproportionate burden on those census tracts that have a higher share of people of color compared to those that have a higher share of white households. So for me, it raises the question that, in our Portland plan, this aspirational document defines equity as sharing benefits and burdens. Are we meeting that intention with what these outcomes might be? I'm not sure I have an answer as to how we fix that, but to me, that's the nature of how we're asking these questions. These potential outcomes really point to the third part of the framework for me, which is, as Madeline alluded to, that third point around supporting a broader spectrum of solutions. And then it also comes with a couple of corollaries. Let me talk a little bit first though about the supporting a broader spectrum of solutions. So at the state level with HB 2001, in addition to this addition of the housing choice through middle missing housing, there was also earlier in the session a suite of tenant protections that were passed. And we also saw a greater investment in housing affordability, housing development at the legislative level. So one of the corollaries to the support of broader spectrum of solutions, though, was that you also need to mind your bedfellows. And this really came to my attention last year when California was talking about increasing density around transit stations, and you saw some opposition to that from frontline communities. And so again, it really highlighted the need for us to have this nuanced conversation about how we navigate these intersections. You know, what you see are folks coming down on different sides of these issues, right? And so, you know, we've got some of these folks out there, and of course, we got some of these folks that are part of this, that, you know, maybe the antecedent that emerges from having NIMBYs. But then I'd also offer that we need to make room in this nuanced conversation for this need for housing affordability, while also understanding the perspectives of our frontline communities that we might need their own catchy acronym, which is what I'm proposing here. And of course, I'm being a little facetious here. I don't know if it'll catch on, but again, it really hints at the need for us to bring into these conversations these different perspectives, including those from frontline communities. And the framework for me really is a yes and framework. It's both being able to increase housing opportunity and making sure we are looking what the impacts are on frontline communities. Again, you know, as Gordon pointed out, there are many positive aspects to what's happening with HB 2001. We want to make sure that we are sharing those benefits equitably among the different communities. And then finally, the other piece, you know, I'll talk about the other corollary is recognizing that carrots don't work if you aren't hungry. And to me, where I saw this is we are seeing some communities now that continue to come forward and oppose increased density or increased housing choice. And I'm not sure if Taylor or Morgan would characterize, you know, what their plans are as carrots or sticks, but, you know, if a community is already opposed to increasing density or bringing in multifamily housing, then just asking them to allow these middle missing options may not get us to where we want to be. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we implement sticks, but it recognizes that there's, again, that broader spectrum of solutions that are needed, including for communities that are not on their own willing to bring these efforts forward. So with that, I'm going to go right into questions, I think, and Christina will grab control, but there's my 5 points there, and then also the contact information for our presenters today if folks want to get in touch with us.
Thank you. And actually, I think Taylor wants to make a few comments about a Senate Bill 608, I think. Taylor, do you want to take over here for a moment?
Yes, I just wanted to thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Alan's point about, and Madeline's, about the need for a broad spectrum of solutions. And I just wanted to say that both the Speaker's Office and the legislature were really intentional about the 2019 session, including a really broad range of solutions. So the tenant bill that Alan mentioned was a statewide anti-displacement effort, also the first of its kind in the country. And it passed at the very beginning of session, which I think was really important in terms of paving the path for having the conversation about middle housing, because there was this acknowledgement that the thing we needed to do first was put some anti-displacement measures in effect and pass some tenant protection. So that bill, Senate Bill 608, passed at the very beginning of session, and I think was actually, although not directly tied, was instrumental in moving the conversation forward about the whole range of things that we need to be doing to increase choice in communities, make sure that we're also doing work to protect tenants from displacement, both legal evictions and economic evictions, and then also building more subsidized affordable housing. So that was kind of the pronged approach. So I just wanted to just to reiterate that point, that the whole spectrum is really important, and that House Bill 2001 was just one piece of that much larger package.
Thank you. And actually, I think we're going to start with a couple questions regarding kind of the nuts and bolts of the House bill. If you can, and I think maybe Taylor, you'll want to start with us on this one. Could you talk about who was at the table in drafting this legislation? As in, were there any local planners around the table to give their 2 cents?
Yeah, so the process for the drafting of the bill, it started as sort of a broad framework before it went into drafting to Legislative Council, but there was stakeholder input that was that the Speaker's office facilitated from the Housing Alliance, which is a statewide organization. We also took lots of comments and feedback throughout the process from all kinds of stakeholders, both through public testimony and then through folks emailing me their questions and concerns, and kind of having a back and forth around technical changes or clarifications that folks wanted. And so planners weighed in through that process in particular, but just having those conversations and talking about where additional clarity was needed. We worked really closely with the Oregon chapter folks. You all have, I believe, I don't know the name of your group, but I know the other group that specifically engages on the policy side. And so we had a lot of back and forth about their technical concerns with the legislation, and tried to accommodate technical changes to make clarifications where they were needed at the local planning level. So the bill started as a big framework bill that it started as a large framework. Like the goal of passing it was to make sure that these housing choices were allowed across the state. And then we worked very diligent. I spent much of my session in communication with many stakeholders, getting feedback on and making tweaks to the bill in response to that feedback.
And this is Gordon. I would add to that, Taylor didn't mention, the League of Oregon Cities was involved heavily in the bill's discussion. They got a lot of input from local planners as well. So we did, and in fact, I would say the biggest contribution they made to the bill was the issue of infrastructure and potential for areas that had some infrastructure deficiencies and the accommodation of that in the bill.
And Gordon, while we have you, could you tell us, is middle housing defined in the state's model code, and how is it defined?
Yes, middle housing is actually defined in the statute, and if we need to further define it in our administrative rules, we can do that as long as it's consistent with the statute. But there's the different types where a duplex was defined, a triplex, a fourplex, a row house or townhouse, which was defined as an attached unit on an individual lot, and then also the cottage cluster definition is in the statute as well, and I think you can look and see that definition in there.
Great, thank you. Next question, maybe Alan, I think you were the one that was using this term the most, or jargon, I guess, for that. If you could identify for us frontline community, could you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, and I think it really is a way for those communities who have been targeted and impacted by some of these policies in the past to frame themselves now, right? That they really are on the front lines of the impacts that we have been seeing since the early part of the 20th century. And so that's why I've started to use that term. It comes from communities that have had that experience.
Thank you. All right, in our few minutes that we have remaining, let's talk money. What sort of concerns, I guess, or encouragements were raised by developers in this process, the ones who are going to be coming in with the cash money, kind of following through on these bills?
Sorry, this is Taylor. Can you clarify that a little bit? You mean what did developers think about the bill, or?
Yes, I think so. Or what kind of concerns, or are they concerned about any portions of the bill? Do they agree with the bill?
Yeah, I can take that first. So the bill had on my last slide a really broad range of both affordable and market rate housing developers who were in support of the legislation. I think it's important to note that it includes subsidized affordable housing developers because, as Madeline mentioned, folks like Habitat for Humanity can stretch their public subsidy further in creating affordable units, especially affordable homeownership units, if they can spread the land cost over more units. So that's very important. And then also the state made some investments in what is our statewide affordable housing development fund. And some of that fund is carved out for homeownership. So there was intentionality around increasing options for affordable housing developers in high opportunity neighborhoods, and then funding to actually create some of those affordable homeownership opportunities. And we have a number of culturally specific affordable housing developers in the metro region in particular that develop homeownership opportunities specifically for communities that have experienced discrimination historically and currently. So I'm thinking of PCRI as an example. So yes, there was a coalition of developers that were in support of the legislation.
And if this, Gordon, the Home Builders Association was involved, the kind of the classic developer organization in Oregon, in support. There was some concern that some cities might use the new bill to make unrealistic assumptions about redevelopment in existing neighborhoods, and the bill actually has some language that addresses that concern as well. So they were very much on board with the bill.
But at the beginning, they were very concerned about the language around banning single family housing. So because, as many of you know, home builders, their bread and butter is single family housing development. So it was important to that group in particular. It took a little bit of time to get comfortable with the idea of middle housing, since the home builders in particular tend to do more single family.
This is Madeline. Just really quickly, that was also one of the major frames messaging wise that we ended up having to spend a lot of time kind of working through and making sure that we had reliable answers for. During my presentation, my last slide was actually a link to a memo that a couple of Sightline colleagues wrote with detailed kind of messaging, both lessons and comebacks for some of the hardest things to talk about. So I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that toolkit is linked from my last slide, which I think you guys will all have access to. But as Taylor mentioned, that was a really big point that we had to do a lot of work on.
Okay, thank you. And Madeline, thank you also for mentioning your presentation. We've had a couple questions again. Yes, we're recording this webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube, search Planning Webcast, will pop up. And we are going to have a PDF copy of this entire presentation available on our webcast webpage, so you can get the link there that Madeline was referring to, and also you'll have the contact info for all of our speakers, because you guys, we had between 40 and 50 questions come in, and we got to, half a dozen maybe. So this topic is clearly very important, and there are still a lot of unanswered questions. So folks, feel free to reach out and get those questions answered. So to all of you speaking today from the Oregon area, thank you so much for joining us. And to those that organized it from the Oregon chapter, thank you. And everyone, have a great weekend. We will talk next time.